This is the best of First and Last, the podcast.
We finally made it. Congrats. Y'all did really good this week. Gold stars across the board. It's Friday. We did it. And not only is it Friday, it's not just your average run-of-the-mill Friday. No, it's Conference Championship Friday. Now, it's not quite Conference Championship Eve, but it's damn close, and it feels like that. Because as we say around here, you got no more sleeps till the weekend. You are there. You have woken up and get to bask in the glory of Friday, knowing that this weekend you get one of the best shots of football that we get all year. You get two big-time matchups this year, and man, at the rate we're going, guys, maybe the greatest quartet in the history of Conference Championship weekend. I give you Blake Bortles. I give you Case Keenum. I give you Nick Foles. And man, a late add to the party, we may be giving you a healthy shot of Brian Hoyer. Tell me that doesn't light your fire. Tell me that doesn't get you hyped for some football. Now, the reason we say that is because we are now in day 2 of Tom Brady Handgate, or as we've dubbed it,
Hands Across America!
Just a couple breaks in the chain. We were so close. It's amazing. But as we keep tabs on the most famous right hand in all sports, and kudos to Tom Brady for being so important that he has dodged all of the normal jokes that come with a right hand injury in the world of sports. Really proud of him. But we've gotten into this vein now where Tom Brady Handgate has spanned 2 days in a way that most of us didn't think was going to happen. Originally, when this comes out, as most things the Patriots tend to have happen, they try and minimize it. Most people around it indicate when you hear Tom Brady gets bumped into in practice, you just assume that it's going to be one of those things that we talk about early in the week that drums up a little controversy but then doesn't end up manifesting. Yet we get into yesterday, and all of a sudden, the sound starts to conflict. And that's when you know you've got a real story, is when the sound coming in our direction holds absolutely no consistency. Like in the same day, you can hear Ben Vollen go from the Boston Globe on Spain and Fitz and talk about how the Patriots need to be very concerned about Tom Brady's hand.
You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going like a 6 or a 7 on this one. I don't think this is the Patriots playing head games with the Jaguars. I think this is a real injury on Tom Brady's throwing hand. You don't like to see your quarterback miss your Thursday practice before the AFC Championship game. He was wearing a glove on that right hand today, and you know, we're all examining the photos like it was the Kennedy assassination, looking for proof of something. And his right thumb looked awful boxy. It sure looked like he was wearing some sort of splint or something. And if that's the case, that is the wrong finger you want to injure.
First and last of Mike Golic Jr. From the people who brought you the LeBron James Lonzo Ball lip reader comes the Tom Brady hand analysts from afar. So we've got that. Patriots, very worried. 7. Pretty risky this late in the week. Saw Dante Stallworth point out on Twitter, worth noting that Thursday is usually third down day, which is an important part of the game planning section of every week. Football practice schedules during the week are usually broken down by the situations you cover. First and second down are on your first day of the practice week. So in the NFL on Wednesday, third down in those situations on Thursday. And for the Patriots, this is one of their full padded practice. We know those are at a premium in the new collective bargaining agreement, so they're extremely important. But as Bill Belichick has always often pointed out, there is nothing more important than the health of the team. So we pair that sound up with, of course, noted Patriot hero, ESPN's very own, Teddy Bruschi, joined the Six yesterday and said, of course, this injury is not serious.
I don't think this is serious. I don't think Tom even would hit it on somebody's helmet. No one would ever get close like that. I'm assuming that it was a handoff. It was a handoff to a running back. He sprained a finger, sprained a thumb. He'll be okay.
First and last here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Not serious. Nothing to write home about here. I do enjoy that, like, the concept, because I talked about it the other day, the sacred cylinder in the world of football practice surrounding quarterbacks, especially quarterbacks as important as Tom Brady. There will be no more contentious situation in a practice in football than if you see some hapless idiot defensive lineman get inside the cylinder, the imaginary halo. You kind of remember the halo surrounding the punt returner it used to be. I forget what the term was exactly, but there was a penalty for even being within this arbitrary halo surrounding the punter that they thankfully did away with. Well, that exists around the quarterback in practice, and you will start a full-on riot if a defender finds his way in there. And for Teddy Bruschi, clearly that has been the situation for so long in New England that the concept that anyone would be around Tom Brady when he is following through on the ball is so foreign to him because, again, this Patriot way is an ironclad set of warrior beliefs that does not allow for your deviation from what they normally do around here. Now, somewhere in the middle of all this, because again, we're around these different opinions, and if we had to call it here, if I had to call it here, I would say this. Normal protocol for the Patriots usually indicates that they're not going to give us any information they don't want. But at the same time, this concern seems to be legitimate. Now, you've got backup quarterback all-star Brian Hoyer out here who came out and talked basically perfectly describing the mental rep he's taking in practice, which is just so abundantly Patriot. Describing the system of coming in and taking reps on the sideline, even when he's not getting the live reps. Quote, I prepare every week like I'm going to play. Whether I do or don't, that's not really up to me. I think it's one thing I can benefit since I was a backup last time. I've played a lot of football. I've been a starter on 4 teams. I know how to prepare like a starter. Whether I'm getting the reps or not, each rep I'm taking a mental rep. I stand back there and go through and think, where would I go with the football on this? Who would I make the middle linebacker on this play? Thank you for that intimate description from Brian Hoyer. Our own Mike Reese found his way somewhere in the middle on all this, and I think this is where we should probably land. Like, this isn't nothing. We wouldn't be talking about this if it was nothing. That being said, if you think this is really going to have an effect on the outcome of the game, I think we'd all be sadly mistaken. This reeks of a situation where, despite all that, Tom Brady goes out and has one of those classic all-time Tom Brady games that makes us all feel silly for even giving this any bit of credence. Again, Mike Reese joining SE6.
This isn't something to dismiss as insignificant, but they do believe it is something that Brady can manage, and it might affect him in Sunday's AFC Championship game to a degree here. And here's the thing, the Patriots' actions have reinforced this. They have just 2 quarterbacks on their roster, and if they felt like Brady couldn't play, they probably would have made a move for a 3rd quarterback. But it is significant that Brady was not at practice today. This was a full pads practice, their most important practice of the week, and it reminds me of something that I asked Bill Belichick about a month ago when Brady was in and out of practice, and I said, how significant is that? He said, look, the only way to build team execution is from team practice. Michael, you don't have the quarterback, the most important player on the team, out at practice before your most important game of the season. That's big news for the Patriots.
Thankfully, the one guy that you are missing out at practice is the guy that's been doing it longer than and better than everyone else. So I think you can feel a little bit more comfortable about that. And obviously, the key for Tom has always been get pressure and get him down. The Patriots' record changes drastically when you can sack Brady over 3 times. We've seen, even going back to 2015 was the most glaring example of this, when the Denver Broncos came and absolutely hit him up in their playoff matchup, put Brady on his back on almost a third of his dropbacks, and it's no way to win for any quarterback, even the greatest of all time. And so with Tom now, you've just got to get him in a situation where you need to think about it. Always said that when it came to battle in the trenches, if you saw anything taped up, that was your indication that you wanted to test it early. You see a guy walk out there with a brace in a place that he doesn't normally have it, that tends to be the spot where you aim. It's not an intent to injure. It's not an intent to maim. It's just an intent to make him think twice. Because you know the minute that something has to become in the foreground of your thought, and for Tom Brady, the whole point of why he of all people would be able to miss practice is because so much of what they do is second nature to him. So much of what he's been through is the Rolodex of what he's already seen. And so what do you have to do? Something happened to that hand, so you've got to make him think about it. And if you're Jacksonville, you've got the dogs to do this. You've got the horses up front to make this thing run. So you get in that cylinder, and even if you're not necessarily knocking him down, you're getting him around. And if he's thinking about following through, and one of those passes is errant, between Boye and Jalen Ramsey on the back end, you've got the guys that can take minuscule errors, because you saw the throws it took to beat Jacksonville last week with two of the best offensive players in the world, Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown. You saw the pinpoint accurate throws from Ben and the minuscule windows that they had to exploit in order to put up points on that defense and even be competitive in the game. So the minute you can get something errant is the minute you have a chance against a team that, top to bottom, outside of that defense, you're probably a touch overmatched on.
First and Last, the podcast.
We got close to the simplicity of a recess-style format in a game involving the best basketball players in the world. We got close, but we didn't quite get there. So the All-Star starters came out yesterday. We had the leading vote-getters broken down. For the Eastern Conference, it looks like this. For the starters, the front court, LeBron James, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Joel Embiid. The guards, Kyrie Irving and DeMar DeRozan. For the West, the front court, Kevin Durant, Anthony Davis, DeMarcus Cousins. The guards, Steph Curry and James Harden. Now, the breakdown of the voting also came out, and we had LeBron James in the Eastern Conference as the leading vote getter, surpassing Giannis late in the game. And in the Western Conference, Steph Curry. So we'll have both of them voted as captains for this game, which of course means they get to pick. It's again, recess-style draft of certain players. The problem being is that we don't get to see that process. We don't get to trust that process, which is unfortunate in all of this for us, because it really deprives us of the only thing that this setting is about, which should be the drama and the politics behind who is being selected here. The NBA, going back to this offseason, has been largely battling for the most interesting league in the world title on the backs of the drama surrounding its key players. Now, until this past week, that drama hadn't really manifested itself in physical altercations the way that's become very in vogue. It used to just be good old-fashioned passive aggressiveness, off-season moves, and some bad blood based on trades. The highlight in the Eastern Conference would no doubt be LeBron James and Kyrie Irving and what's going to happen there, because we know in all of this now, you're not beholden to any conference for who you pick on your team. So there are chances for teammates and former teammates to end up with a different conference captain if they so choose. I don't know why the NBA, a league that's so built on drama that the Knicks were actually a story for a lion's share of the year last year, against all odds. But they want to deprive us of this, with the guys being that, well, when it comes down to it, these guys are all all-stars. We don't want anyone feeling like they're the last guy picked at recess, belittling the experience, somehow making it a lesser accomplishment if someone were to be the last pick in all of this. And I keep coming back to, I feel like even though he's not voted an all-star, Kevin Love would still find a way to be the last pick. Like, he seems like a guy that everyone would just be comfortable sequestering over in that role, and I really think it's a shame. The Cavaliers are figuring that out, by the way, right now. Someone who did figure out the keys to the game, though, in all of this, 76ers forward Joel Embiid. So in the midst of all this, and we'll delve a little bit more into why it is such a travesty that the All-Star game pick'em goes on in a secret vote, we've at least got Joel Embiid, who we know is going to be up front with us about everything. If you guys will recall, I believe it was a year or two ago, Joel Embiid shot his shot with a very famous star in the world of music and acting, One Bad Girl Riri. And she hit him with the "come back to me when you're an all-star." Crushing blow. Really a tough pill to swallow at the time for a guy with as much confidence as Joel Embiid. And so, Joel Embiid finally voted an all-star. You bet people went and started digging up the receipts. And this is why he is the prince that was promised. Here was his response when asked what he planned to do now.
Your team is trying to cool you off here, but years ago, you were denied by a young woman who told you to come back when you were an all-star. Is there anything you'd like to say to anybody on TNT right now?
I mean, she denied me back then, so why go with her again? So I have to pass that and move on to the next one.
You've got the mic. Anything you'd like to say?
Trust the process.
Ooh!
The prince that was promised. Only a fool trips over what's behind them. Joel knows that he's destined for great things. As someone who adheres strongly to the process. And while that effort is heroic, and I certainly appreciate that, I'm here to shine light on all the little people that find their way to heroism. Usually, it's the team from Stats and Info around here that manages to every once in a while get really bold and slip a meme into the Stats and Info packet that they send out to us, which is a place that's not usually home to that kind of humor. I pull up ESPN.com this morning, and I don't know who is writing headlines, and I know we took a lot of flack from other people for covering Danica Patrick and Aaron Rodgers' new relationship, but whoever the hero was that wrote this headline on the top of .com, Rude Boy, All-Star Embiid dismisses Rihanna, you, my friend, have won the Friday.
First and last, the podcast. First and last, the podcast.
I don't want to take the wind out of anyone's sails. It's Friday. We made it. You're out of sleep for the week. You get to go on to the weekend feeling good, and I said you get to feel even better because it is conference championship weekend, and we've got two great football games that we're going to get ready to watch. Hell, you might get to see Brian Hoyer play a game this weekend. Look what God did. We'll get you guys an update later on in the case of the most famous right hand in America, by the way.
Hands across America!
So don't worry, you're good on that front. But in the meantime, it is a reminder that this is also one of the last few weekends of football. We got the Pro Bowl next week. I don't know if that counts necessarily, but we got real football this weekend. And then we got the Super Bowl, and then we got a bit of a hiatus. So just a reminder, live in the moment, be where your feet are, enjoy it. Maybe take off the dog masks if you're in Philadelphia so you can see the game for a little bit. And be safe and have fun. Because you never know when something might come to an end. And I found that out the hard way yesterday. I didn't even think this was a possibility until yesterday. And maybe that was just my own naivete. Maybe it was just me trying to hold on to something that had been a fixture in my life as a football fan for almost 11 years now. And that's Joe Thomas. The headline yesterday, Browns' Joe Thomas still undecided on playing future. Joe Thomas, his 11th season this year, saw the end of what was finally celebrated as a streak of over 10,000 consecutive snaps in the NFL. Guy hadn't missed a snap in his entire career this season until a triceps injury ended his season prematurely, and now has him saying this in the offseason, had surgery on October 22nd against Tennessee, underwent surgery and said, I'm going to sit down with my family and kind of discuss where I am about continuing to play this before their season finale. I think it will come down to really, first and foremost, my health. Do I feel like I'm still playing at an elite level, and do I still love it? For me, I feel like when I make that decision, which will be after the season, that's really what it's going to come down to. And for Joe Thomas, you understand this is a guy that's going to have a ton of options. Him and actually Andrew Hawkins, who's been doing work with us for Operation Football at Field Yates on Sundays during the NFL season, started a podcast called The Tomahawk Show that's already climbing up the charts on iTunes. and you've seen him basically being the pseudo weatherman for Browns games towards the end of the year. He's a guy who gets it. And so he's going to have options. What becomes interesting is what that means for the Browns, because, listen, certainly for me, Joe Thomas is probably one of the 3 greatest tackles to play professional football. He's probably the best tackle I've seen in my time as a football fan on this earth. A guy that you could count on. I mean, going back to the day, I remember the story of him fishing on draft day when he was selected. All those things that get built into the folklore now, and you get the closer you get to seeing him. So the idea of that career coming to the end is certainly jarring for offensive line circles who have come to appreciate him. You know, my offensive line coach in college for a year, Frank Verducci, would bring us in and sit us down, especially the tackles. Have you watched Joe Thomas's sets on tape? So this is a guy that I have seen from that vantage point in football for a long time that may be walking out the door, which makes all the more compelling now for the Browns the question of what they do. This is maybe the most important Browns draft in quite some time for this team, a team that has watched their team go 1-30 over the last couple of years, and now faces the prospect of, all right, you got rid of Sashi Brown, you're trying to move in a different direction, you've got 2 picks in the top 10 of this draft, in the top 5 of this draft, I should say, and so what are you going to do with it? Our own Mel Kiper Jr. put out his first mock draft the other day, went on Golic and Wingo, and talked about the quarterback that he believes the Cleveland Browns are going to take in this draft. The Rosen one. Excuse me. Too many Joshes in this draft. The Allen one, Josh Allen.
You look at the prototype in terms of size, arm, mobility, competitiveness, and you're the Cleveland Browns and you're playing outside in inclement weather. You're playing in Cincinnati, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, and you have to have that type of skill set. He did it at Wyoming and Laramie, and certainly late in the year, you think about the shoulder, but he came back from that, played in their bowl game, and did a great job. Made every NFL throw imaginable.
First and last of Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. So Mel Kiper's big board for the NFL draft reads like this. Number 1 overall, Saquon Barkley. Number 2, Bradley Chubb. Number 3, Minkah Fitzpatrick. Number 4, Josh Allen. So this here would have the Cleveland Browns taking in the first round potentially a running back and a quarterback. Now, deciding the future for this Cleveland Browns team is going to be based largely on the quarterback position. Would be interesting to see in all seriousness, especially because I don't know if this is an especially tackle-rich draft in the way that we've seen last year. The names you'll see, Connor Williams, Orlando Brown, Mike McGlinchey from Notre Dame floating around near the first round. I'm not sure if any of those guys would qualify as top 10 picks in a way that the Browns would go after in that regard. Quarterback's still going to seem to be the most important position, and the only thing that comes to mind for me, because Josh Allen is a guy that certainly you can play the numbers game however you want this last year, completion percentage-wise, raw stats-wise, it was a definite letdown year. His bowl game performance left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, and just in general, it was a guy that underperformed this year based on expectation in a way that really the top 3 quarterbacks in this year's draft all did for the most part. That's why Baker Mayfield made up so much ground late. But what becomes interesting is what the ramifications for this are. And the minute I heard Mel indicate this, and Josh Allen jumped out right away as the quarterback that the Cleveland Browns were not going to be able to look away from as a group that's passed on top-end skill sets the last couple of years that ended up being the demise for Sashi Brown. Can already say this. If the Browns end up taking Josh Allen, this to me seems like the end of Hugh Jackson's tenure in Cleveland. Because the way we see it, he is going to be just good enough to get drafted to that position, nowhere near ready enough to step in and be the guy for them this year. And as we've seen, when push comes to shove in the last couple of years, when you draft a raw quarterback who's going to need time to develop, it makes you take an extra long look, not at the quarterback because you just got him on board, but at the guy who's developing him. And if the guy who's developing him has another season riddled with losses the way this one was for the Browns, and Hugh Jackson, who already has that 1-win record on his mantle through the course of his first couple of seasons in Cleveland, I don't know how he survives that. So I'd be sweating out that decision. I know he's a guy who's confident in his ability to develop quarterback. I don't know if I'm confident in the early returns on investment from Josh Allen enough to believe that it allows him to keep his job.
First and last, the podcast. First and last, the podcast.
You guys can find him, the head of Football Outsiders, at footballoutsiders.com, one of our ESPN insider analysts, and my favorite version of his Twitter bio, former Spring Break Beach MC, Aaron Schatz, joining us now here. And Aaron, before we get into anything else, I have to ask, especially around this time of year, as it gets cold up in the New England parts, is there any part of you that still misses the days of yesteryear as the Spring Break MC?
It's really hard to believe that my year in Daytona Beach actually happened. For those people who don't know, I was a radio disc jockey in Daytona Beach, Florida 20 years ago. That's actually how I got my start out of college. Not what people normally think of for a stats guy. But it actually played a really important role in what I do now, because that was the year I really got hooked on the Patriots and the NFL. And the Patriots, which were my hometown team, played the Jaguars, who were the team of the place I had just moved to, in the AFC Championship game that year, the 96 season, which was January of 97, when I was living down there. And that's how I became a hardcore football fan. And here I am now, and we've got the Patriots and Jaguars again.
It's pretty amazing. I wish the timeline had matched up in a way where I could imagine maybe a young Rob Gronkowski was down there on spring break taking in the sights and sounds of all of this.
I think he was 8. He was like 8 years old at that point. So if he was down there, he was probably not on the beach having me throw condoms to him from like the stage before some reggae band played or whatever we did to promote back then.
You know what? I wouldn't put it past 8-year-old Gronk knowing that family to say that he might have still been involved in that. I'm not going to sell that guy short because I believe in his ability as Yo Soy Fiesta. So
he was there with his brothers. The problem is the oldest brother is the one whose name no one ever remembers because he's the one who played baseball instead of football, but maybe he was of age.
Maybe he was at that point. I have to imagine even the Gronk brother that played baseball was probably breaking bats and chugging beers in the dugout. So
he also was Fiesta, yes.
There we go. Of course, all of the Gronks are Fiesta. Well, I mean, it couldn't be a better tie-in then, considering you had conference championship weekend with the matchup of the same two teams, and now we are coming up on that in the NFL season this weekend. And you hear certainly so many different ways to preview this, but you guys obviously operate the Football Outsiders website, and maybe for people that just aren't quite familiar, we've used occasionally on this podcast the DVOA statistic that you guys do, but just in general, what's the angle that you guys have come at football from on the Football Outsiders website?
Yeah, the basic idea was to do stat analysis the way a coach would think, so a lot of, thinking about things situationally. So the DVOA stat, that's the main rating that we use, takes every play and looks at the success of that play based on the down and distance. Then it compares it to a baseline of how an average team does in that situation and adjusts it based on the opponent. So the goal of this is to not give teams credit for 8-yard gains on 3rd and 10, but to look at just what kind of gains truly are successful in the down and distance. Obviously, for example, you can't throw a 40-yard pass in the red zone, so you can't penalize teams for not going deep when you can't go deep. We kind of take all of that into consideration when we do our ratings.
And I think that's important because you hear about this all the time. I know selfishly as a former offensive lineman, and when you listen to guys like Joe Thomas who speak eloquently about the position, they'll always talk about, for us it's more efficient runs than it is, like you said, the distance there. If we need 2 in that situation and you get 4, that still goes down in the book as a run that against the normal standard would be positive in that situation. So, and I know especially for right now where we are in the playoffs, the way you guys weight DVOA basically discount a lot of the first half of the season and treat it like coaches would, where you look more at the recency of the last 4, 5, 6 games to really drive home the results, correct?
It's a little longer than that, actually. The last 2 months are about at full strength. We have the regular rating, and then we have the weighted rating. And the weighted rating is the one that, discounts the first month of the season. And then the October is sort of, a little bit of strength. And then we mostly are measuring November and December, and then a little bit, obviously, the playoffs. But that's obviously really important when you talk about both teams. With the Jaguars, you had a big change in their defense when they picked up Marcel Darius at midseason. And with the Patriots, obviously, you had terrible defense the first month of the season, and then much better defense ever since then.
And I guess specifically for those two units, certainly we can point to Marcel Darius on the side of Jacksonville, especially as far as interior rush defense. But for the Patriot, from your guys' perspective, what did you see change for them really over the course of the season, since that really was the huge headline to start the year?
Yeah, I don't know if there was any personnel. I mean, they lost Dante Hightower, but I think the coverage there were so many blown coverages early in the season, and the coverage just got much better. Stephon Gilmore just had a much better idea of what he was doing in this defense. They got good nickel back. Unfortunately, Jonathan Jones is injured now. He won't be playing in this game. But the run defense did not improve. The run defense was actually a problem for the Patriots all year, but the pass defense improved dramatically. They just got on the same page as far as the defense. They had new guys working together, and I guess it took Gilmore a little bit of time to get on the page. Once Gilmore came back from a couple of weeks that he missed with a concussion, the pass defense has been very good ever since.
And I guess that's an easy transition into the game this weekend. So we've got the AFC Championship, Jags and New England going into this weekend. And while New England made pretty easy work of a Titans team that I think made their hay in largely the same way, at least predicated on that ground attack, but with Jacksonville, we know it's even more so because of the deficiency at quarterback for them. So is it as simple as Jacksonville is really going to have to lean all the way in on this ground game to have any chance against New England?
I think that's really important because obviously that's a weakness for the Patriots, and we don't exactly know what's up with Fournette's ankle. What's interesting is that when the Jaguars try to throw, first of all, in the last 6 weeks of the regular season, they were the best play-action team in the league with 17 yards per reception and 82% completion rate in those last 6 weeks. Bortles used play-action over half the time against Pittsburgh last week. And, of course, they say the run sets up the play-action, and you don't have to be good at the run to set up play action. What you have to is make the defense think you're going to run, and I think that that's what the Patriots defense is going to be expecting from the Jaguars, so the Jaguars can use the play action and go over the top. But they also might want to be going short, so it's sort of interesting. I looked at the Patriots pass defense in that first awful month compared to the rest of the year by direction, and in most of the field they've improved dramatically except for one place, the short middle. In the short middle, the Patriots ranked 29th in the first month and 29th in the 3 months since. And the Jaguars' best passing direction just happens to be the short middle. So the Patriots are really good covering tight ends, but not as much receivers. I would look for some crossing patterns from the receivers on the underneath and maybe man beaters. That might be a good way to get the ball through the air going down the field against the Patriots.
And also it gives Blake Bortles an area that he can be most comfortable with. I mean, again, going back to what we saw against Pittsburgh, it was certainly a lot of short passes, a lot of screens, a lot of things that were well within his wheelhouse, even off play action in a first quarter where he well exceeded normal season averages for him. So if we've got that on that side, which again, I think the Leonard Fournette ankle that you mentioned is a huge factor in setting up everything with that. But on the other side for the Patriots, we look at a Jacksonville defense that is certainly rolling into this game with a bunch of confidence, went out and gave up a lot of points against a great offense in Pittsburgh last week, but in general on the season has been one of the more counted on units. I know for DVOA rank for you, I think they're fourth right now in DVOA. So when you look at that defense against the Patriot offense, how do Bill Belichick and Tom Brady attack that unit?
Well, I mean, I realized that they got the touchdowns. Pittsburgh got touchdowns by going deep to wide receivers with insane plays where the Jaguars were in good coverage and just amazing catches by like Antonio Brown and Martavis Bryant. But the Jaguars are number one against opposing number one receivers. They're in the top dozen against number two and number three receivers. Like, the cornerbacks are the strength of that secondary. The place where they are relatively weak is that they're only average against tight ends and against running backs. And also, if you look at sort of a personnel breakdown that I got from our friends at Sports Info Solutions, the Jaguars particularly struggle to cover tight ends and running backs when the opponents are in like a 12 or a 21 personnel, so not three wide. So a lot of times when I look at numbers, I'm telling teams to spread it out, but the Patriots probably are best going with more power-type personnel here and then trying to get to the tight ends and the running backs. Especially, it's really interesting, the Jags gave up some big numbers to like really unknown tight ends like Ricky Seals-Jones and Tyler Kroft. And I wonder if this is the game where they finally get a big play on one of those seam routes to Jacob Hollister, the third tight end, when they go with like the 3 tight end package. They've tried to do it a few times this year. It's never quite turned into the big play. I wonder if this is the week where they're paying so much attention to Gronk that, either Allen or Hollister breaks out for a big play.
It is interesting to hear you say that, too, because so much of the analysis I've seen this week is, well, Tom Brady and the Patriots, they'll spread him and go 5 wide. They'll try and get this defense out of the box where they've had so much success. But to your point, even in the game last week for New England against Tennessee, you saw Gronk lining up in the backfield on some sets to try and get some interesting mismatches. And we've seen the Patriots sort of morph to be whatever they're going to need. So you're essentially saying that heavier personnel set could be the place where they make hay.
If they go 5 wide, I think it'll be 5 wide with the heavier personnel set. It'll be 5 wide, but one of those will be Dion Lewis and one will be Gronk and maybe one will be James Devlin.
Very interesting. And using big personnel is a lot of where Atlanta had success last year. That's one of you look at the new currency of the NFL and it seems to be that tight end running back position that exploits the middle of the field. And I think we see that in both aspects of this weekend, at least when you look at where teams have a lot of production from their personnel. Even going over, if we look at the NFC Championship now between Minnesota and Philadelphia, where you've got 2 great defenses and you've got one offense in particular for Philly that has made most of their success on offense through the air with Zach Ertz in that tight end position, even going back to when it was Carson Wentz at quarterback. So especially now for what you've seen out of that Eagles team with Nick Foles at the helm, I mean, how do they go against a Viking defense and known football savant Mike Zimmer this weekend?
Well, here's the scary part, right? The scary part for the Eagles is that in DVOA, Minnesota is number 2 against tight ends and number 1 against running back in the passing game. So that suggests you're not going to have a lot of success with Ertz. You're not going to have a lot of success on passes to J.H.I. The place where Minnesota's been weakest is slot receivers, which makes sense, I think, because Xavier Rhodes is so good. And there's weaknesses with the rest of the corners. Terrence Newman is pretty good most of the time, but Mackenzie Alexander, Trey Waynes, those guys can be weaknesses. So I think Waynes plays. He's the starter usually opposite of Rhodes. But I think Aguilar could be the big weapon in this game for Philadelphia rather than Ertz or Ajayi in the passing game. And, of course, the run, too. Minnesota stuffs the run. It's such a good all-around defense. They do everything well. It's hard to know what to attack them with.
Yeah, especially with the slot. I mean, we saw Aguilar's big play the other week was sort of the pseudo end around off the bunch set that got them big gains down near the red zone. I mean, is this a guy that you see, exploit more in the pass game, exploit more in the run game for them? So much of the Eagles' rushing attack this season has been about the varied use of their 3-headed monster against a defense that's so athletic and linebacker and safety. I mean, does this have to be one where the pass sort of mimics a run game a little bit more?
I'm thinking the pass game. It's numbers. Statistical analysis isn't going to tell you much about when an end around is going to work. I think that's a lot more about what you see on film about whether teams over pursue and how they react to certain looks. You get an end around against them. I think the stats here are more about what Aguilar is going to do in the passing game. But the one place where Minnesota is not really good in coverage is against slot receivers.
Good to know here. And then on the other side, I mean, listen, these 2 defenses, while Zimmer's defense, I think, is a little more opportunistic and a little more varied in the blitz package, both are going to win in large part because of personnel. And Philadelphia up front definitely has the horses for that at defensive line and linebacker. What do you see the Vikings trying to do on offense against them?
Well, here's the scary thing for the Eagles is that Case Keenum led the league in ESPN QBR when under pressure. That means even if the Eagles are bringing pressure, Keenum could put up big numbers. And I think part of that is, first of all, he's kind of a sandlot quarterback, right? His style, he's good when he's just, when he's out there kind of playing scramble drill. But the other thing is Thielen and Diggs are so good at also playing scramble drill, big catch radiuses. So you can pitch the ball downfield to them when you're under pressure, and you can still get positive yards out of it. When you look at Philadelphia in coverage, they're excellent against outside receivers. They're kind of mediocre against tight ends and slot receivers. So it could be a good game for Kyle Rudolph. I guess Jerry is right. Minnesota, that's a weakness of theirs. They're not really good at slot receiver. I mean, Laquan Treadwell is never – he's still waiting to live up to his draft position. But, I think that it's a tough thing for Philly. If pressure doesn't get to Keenum, even when they bring it, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting because you look at it, especially as a front, it's not a group that does a ton. There's a lot of straight rushes. There's not even a lot of really twists and variables that you've got to worry about for an offensive line in Minnesota that did shuffle some parts around last week, that did, have, I think Remmers started at left guard for the first time all season next to Reif. So there was some movement around along there that I thought would net a little bit more of a result than it really did in the outcome of that game. But you mentioned Kyle Rudolph, especially in the end zone. I'm interested, both of these defenses certainly great on third down, but a guy like Malcolm Jenkins, is he someone that we could see really being an issue for Kyle near the end zone?
Well, I mean, Jenkins is great in coverage, absolutely. And, I mean, the one thing I will say, though, is the Philadelphia defense actually weakened a little bit in the red zone, sort of a surprise. But they were 5th overall on defense, but 16th in the red zone. The red zone weakness was equally pass and run. I say weakness, they were average. It's only a weakness because they were so good on the rest of the field.
Makes sense. Now, so looking at all of this here, certainly plenty of strengths and weaknesses to exploit. You guys have your DVOA playoff odds. At this point right now, who would you guys have advancing on to the Super Bowl, and who has the best odds of winning for you at this point?
Well, the Patriots have the best odds of winning. They're the number one team in the weighted ratings, and I mean, I will say Jacksonville is the most inconsistent team in the league. They could show up and shock everybody this week. They could also shock everyone by, not showing up at all and getting clobbered by 28 points. They're so inconsistent that I could very easily imagine both things happening, but you have to clearly favor the Patriots. On the other side, it's really tough. It's a really tough matchup because the difference between the two teams is mostly made up by home field advantage. I would give Minnesota a small edge still because they've been better than Philadelphia, certainly over the last 5 or 6 weeks, a little bit more than what we normally think of as home field advantage. But it's a pretty close game. One thing I will think that's interesting is it's not going to be that cold in the Northeast on Sunday, so Philadelphia may not have as much of that dome team going on the road in the Northeast home field advantage as they were hoping for. They probably were hoping for a really cold night or something. Keenum doesn't have good historic numbers playing outside the cold, but it's not really going to be that cold on Sunday night.
How much does your guys' model weight certain things like that, especially when it factors into weather? I know a lot of people are a little bit leery on home-road splits, especially in the NFL where there are so many variables. But for something like weather and for guys individually, is that a little bit easier for you guys to factor in?
I don't weigh it into our ratings. I weigh it in sort of alongside our ratings. I will say I'm generally a believer that home field advantage is pretty much the same for every team. The exception seems to be Seattle, which seems to have a stronger home field advantage than anyone. Perhaps the fact that you have to fly so far to get there is part of it. I don't know. But for the most part, I think from year to year, sometimes a team will have a really strong home field advantage one year, really weak the next year. It kind of goes back and forth. I tend to think of home field advantage as just sort of a stable thing for all teams. But there's no question that the dome and warm weather teams do tend to struggle a little bit more when it's really cold outside and they have to go into the Northeast. So that was something to watch for in this game, but it's not going to be that cold. It's a night game, so it's not going to be 45, but it's also not going to be 20, and it's not going to be snowing.
And I guess one of the other things I'm always curious in how it gets factored in, just because, listen, for us on the, especially the sports talk radio side, it's always easy when you see a gap in certain places to account for it by saying, such and such team wins the hidden yardage battle, such and such team wins with coaching here in this area. For you guys, I mean, special teams DVOA certainly seems to be a part of what you guys factor in, so that might be a little bit easier to qualify since that's sort of where we always talk about hidden yardage. But is there a way to factor in, what a coach offers, what it means having Belichick on the sideline, as opposed to having someone like Doug Marrone or Doug Peterson, who's in year 2 with his team?
The problem is that anytime we've ever tried to quantify that, what we've ended up with is you end up quantifying all intangibles together. You end up getting a quantity that could be a mixture of luck and team chemistry and coaching. I mean, if you want to talk about coaching decisions, if you want to talk about guys who go for it more often on fourth down, who do the things that analytics say you should do, that you can measure. And the guy who'd come out really ahead in that, not just Belichick, but Doug Peterson. because the Eagles went for it on fourth down more than any other team this year. But if you want to talk about things like game planning, like player motivation, like knowing when to substitute and which guys to put in at which time and which packages to use, we've never been able to come up with any kind of a stat that isolates that doesn't also incorporate a bunch of other intangible things. And, intangibles exist and they're important. It matters that Belichick is the best coach. Like, that matters. I may not be able to measure it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. As I often say, we call them intangibles because they're intangible, so we don't try to measure them, but it doesn't mean they don't exist.
Yeah, interesting note that you mentioned that. I did see there was an article, I think, that went up today documenting the Eagles really making that decision to go for it on fourth down more in the offseason based on the way the number and data for them had driven that. Is that a trend that is becoming increasingly more popular? I know the Steelers for a while were well known for going for it on two much more than anyone else around in the league. Is that something that you see increasing as more and more people might see the success of this data-driven model?
I think the last year or two it has increased. It looked like it was decreasing before then. I mean, I realize that the stats people will tell coaches to go for it on fourth like way more than they do now. But every little bit that you go for it on fourth more helps. You just have to remember offensive levels are so high right now compared to what they were 20 or 30 years ago. Your odds of converting that fourth down are higher, and the cost of giving the ball to the other team is higher than it used to be because offensive levels are so high. I realize offensive levels went down a little bit this year, but they will probably bounce back next year. I think that's mostly because there were so many quarterback injuries.
Makes a lot of sense. All right, finally, let's marry up both of your worlds. Of the final four teams that we've got left on here, which do you think would be the most raucous crowd at spring break? I'm leaning Jacksonville very early in this one based on the personalities that we've seen. I don't want to discount Yo Soy Fiesta and the Patriots, but that would be my early vote. Is there a team that you've seen that might shine?
Players would be the most raucous. Well, the problem is the Patriots players, it's hard to tell how raucous they all are other than Gronk in their personal, because they've all been sort of like hammered into the Patriots mold, where if you say anything about the other team, no Patriots player would ever come out and yell at the fans, we're going to the Super Bowl and we're going to win that B the way that Jalen Ramsey did.
No, yeah, the Patriot way would not vibe well with Jalen, I'm going to imagine. That'd be an interesting mix.
The Jaguars are definitely the most young and rambunctious of these teams, and I think Jalen Ramsey seems like a fun guy to party with.
I think you take those guys in the dog masks from Philadelphia, and you might really be on to something with the group that you could bring down there. A lot of different flags being represented at spring break with those guys. Would have made Daytona Beach interesting.
Yes, definitely.
Awesome stuff. Again, you guys can check Aaron out at footballoutsiders.com. You can also follow him on Twitter. Actually, Aaron, you've got one of my favorite just because, well, it almost sounds like, and I get it confused every time with the old toy store, FAO
Everybody
Schwartz.
Does.
So
Everybody does. Everybody gets confused. I know. My name, we got to Ellis Island and they gave us a crazy spelling. What are you going to do?
Exactly. Well, not FAO Schwartz, but you can follow him on Twitter at FO_A Shots, SCHATZ. And again, the head of Football Outsiders, footballoutsiders.com is where you can check out all this great information. Aaron, we really appreciate the time, man.
All right. Hey, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the First and Last podcast. You can listen and subscribe to all ESPN podcasts in the Listen tab of the ESPN app. First and Last.